Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this fifth era webinar on AI's mythos moment, safety and security. So we're going to be diving into um, a specific risk with regards to this technology, which is around its safety and security, which has been increasingly in the headlines due to um, Anthropic's mythos moment, which we're going to talk about. A quick disclaimer before we jump in. We are a registered investment advisor, so we will not be making any solicitations during this webinar. It's purely educational, and we don't suggest taking investment decisions on this basis. We are going to, in a minute, I'll briefly do an overview of the firm and just take a minute or two on that. And then the majority of the time will be spent on AI safety and security. So starting with what's been happening in the news and therefore, what are the real risks? What's being done to address them, and why, and importantly, why does this matter for capital allocators, for investors, and why this is increasingly an area that needs to be understood. And if there's time at the end, we'll save that for Q&A. So very quickly on the overview, Fifth Year is a specialized asset manager. We invest in exponential tech areas that we believe are transforming everything we do on the planet and will underpin this next era of human life that we are moving into. We're SEC registered in the US and FCA appointed in the UK. This is us at a glance. We've been operating for 12 years across a number of vehicles, largely fund to funds. And in the past few years, we've made a homecoming return to AI in addition to our other tech verticals. And of course, that's the genesis of this webinar. These are some of the VCs we're partnered with and some of the unicorns, over 80 now in our portfolio, which we're very proud of. Our investor value proposition is pretty much to provide global diversified exposure to any given area of tech that we cover, blockchain, AI, et cetera, at the early stage where valuations are still low. And all of our strategy and work has been crafted for these specific technology areas based on our own expertise across the team. And here is that team. So I lead our AI strategy and investments. And we have a growing team. In fact, that open role that says there actually was filled in the past month. So we now have a head of capital formation also on the West Coast. Okay, let's get into AI safety and security. So what happened? Anthropic, who many will be familiar with, but in case you're not, they're a foundation model player. So they've built a large language model. So similar to OpenAI has ChatGPT, Anthropic has Claude. And the difference with them versus some of the other players that they've always had more of an explicit focus on AI safety and alignment. So they've built their models. They have this constitutional AI, as they call it, which tries to basically embed human values directly into the system. So that's kind of been their reputation. And for the first time, they chose restraint over releasing a model. Basically, they had trained this new model that was significantly more advanced in many ways. And then when they were in internal testing, which was these evaluations called Project Glasswing, where they were stress testing it, they found out that there were some concerning behaviors, or more importantly, that there was potential misuse risk because of how powerful the capability had become. So in the hands of hackers, for example, or other bad actors, that this could potentially be a very risky model. And so they decided not to release it publicly. And this is actually, and so instead they released another model with kind of less advanced capability called Mythos. And so this is a really big shift. Historically, in all tech areas, but particularly in AI, it's been this gold rush, race to get adoption. And that's been the incentive. So for one of the largest LLM players to have such a clear signal of restraint really marks a shift in how we're approaching AI safety, security, and risk more broadly. And as a result, this topic has become a global dialogue. So the concern, which was sort of always there percolating and we were aware of it, but now it's becoming very mainstream. And you see, like at the top here, these top headlines are about enterprise risk. So for sure, corporates have been in a major moment of adopting, and they're now forced to think about guardrails, risk governance within the organization, and things like this. These middle headlines are around national security framing. So, this one says AI is top national security concern of 2026, intelligence community says. Or other countries feeling now like that if they're overly reliant on American foundation model shops or tech giants, that would put their own national security at risk. So one thing I will say about that is that with those type of dialogues, we also see unprecedented cooperation, like this transatlantic cooperation on AI and national security. You often see even rivals sitting across the table from one another and collaborating on what sort of response we want to take, which is, I mean, we had the same with nuclear, right? And biotech, whenever our innovations become so powerful that they force that sort of dialogue. And then, of course, the existential concerns where there is, frankly, disagreement. I mean, you see things like could lead to extinction, then others questioning, are they real? What do we do about them? The Economist recently came out with this article saying that existential risk fears are overdone. So there's a real spectrum here as well. And then there's even more than these. I mean, like I'm really at the forefront of this space now, and you see it everywhere. A lot of concern about jobs, disruption to the workforce, future of work, impact on the environment, the building of data centers, and what that means, whether it exacerbates inequality, what does it do to our intelligence? So there's so much here, and we can't focus on all of it. We are going to focus specifically on the safety and security of the technology itself, less the disruptive second and third order effects. But one thing just to frame the moment we're in, and this is not to invalidate any of the risk that there is, but just to say, historically, safety lags behind innovation. And that's been true across the board. Of course, with cars early on, they had no seatbelts and were more prone to accidents. Planes, we had no weather navigation in them early on. And so you had more crashes and things like this. Internet early on didn't have the same guardrails. So you had more shadow usage and misinformation. And arguably, it's still not the safest place, right? But it underpins most of what we do today. So this is just to say it is understandable, given the moment we're in, that we haven't addressed every risk that I just prefaced on the page before. Even though this technology has been around since the 50s and the term was coined then, we are still new in its kind of coming of age moment. We really did reach an inflection point at the end of 2022 when GPT 3.5 came out. And thus, this is now all coming to the forefront. So it feels very loud. The other difference, though, compared to all our past innovations as a species, is that the failure risk with AI is much larger because those failures can scale instantly. They are far more global in nature, and they can fail autonomously without a human in the loop. And that's a big difference, right? Like we feel this lack of control that we haven't experienced before. And it does mean the risks need to be taken even more seriously, I would say, than with our past innovations. Okay, some tea. So I made this iceberg, the AI safety risk iceberg, to try to contextualize what type of risks we're talking about here, because there are a number. And I would say the majority of the conversation to date has focused on these above the waterline, as I call them, risks: model bias, data privacy, cybersecurity and misuse, truth and information integrity. And that's where we're going to zoom in on in a second. But just to name some of the others, and so I made this slide a year ago, and the ones below the waterline certainly weren't at the forefront of, in media and headlines and things like this. I would say even that is changing now. So below, you have more of these sort of what I would call systemic or compounding risks. So protection of critical infrastructure, model poisoning, this alignment problem, which is basically if our AI agents aren't aligned with human values, we can have runaway AI that then either intentionally or unintentionally does harm to us. Supply chain vulnerabilities, which is increasingly coming to the forefront in sort of political dialogue, economic operational cascades, and not just cascades, but also concerns over economic monopoly and, frankly, lack of kind of institutional trust in a lot of the big players. This is for sure, people who are newer to this technology can sometimes conflate AI equals chat GPT, right? Because that's the first thing they're interfacing with, for example. And they're not seeing the broader stack, but they also then are thinking, well, I don't trust that big institution, and therefore I don't support any of it. I want to throw it all out. And it's a result of where we are with AI literacy levels right now. But it also makes sense. I mean, trust at an all-time low across the board. It's not just AI that gets this treatment. There's very low institutional trust more broadly. So that is coming to the forefront as well. And I think it's also one of the reasons that Anthropic chose to be so transparent about this decision. And energy and resource constraint, which is also, very many people will cite concern over data centers being built and the high energy demand of this technology as it currently stands. Again, if they're not deeply technical or understanding the tech, they're not thinking about the fact that the AI today is the most inefficient it will ever be, and that compute always continues to get more efficient and therefore less energy intensive. That no one's lobbying against that it has the potential to make everything we do on the planet more efficient, not less. And therefore, even the most conservative estimates say that it would save far more energy, carbon emissions, et cetera, than it ever demands. But anyway, so the point is we are now going to focus just on the top ones, but I would say all of this now is really up for dialogue, up for debate, and very much front and center in public discourse. But let's focus on the top four. So for each risk area, I'll just briefly explain in plain terms, and then we're going to look at also what is being done and who are some of the companies who are arising now and scaling very rapidly to address these. So data security and privacy. So what's a concern? Sensitive data can be exposed, leaked, or used in ways we don't fully control. So yes, there are AI tools, they can leak sensitive data, sometimes accidentally, or they can be attacked, which is called model exfiltration to gain access to that data. And sometimes, many people are using chat GPT. Again, I use that example. If you're an employee, you may be pasting confidential information into the models without safeguards or without really knowing what you're doing. And that's another, that would be another security issue. And once data is in those systems, we're not super clear on where it goes or how it's being used. So that's that concern. Model integrity, bias, and alignment is referring to the fact that these systems can be wrong or unpredictable. And when they are wrong, we don't always know why or when. So we know, for example, models can hallucinate. They can tell us things that sound confident but are false. They can, if you're using ChatGPT and you make a small tweak in how you ask a question, you can get a totally different output, right? Or it might tell you something. And if you question it, hey, is that really accurate? It may come back and be like, no, you're right. That wasn't true. And I can't find any source for that. So there's that point. And then the bias one is that they can reflect and amplify bias in the data that they're trained on. And this is particularly true right now in that most of the LLMs are trained on publicly available data. Not all, they also have access to proprietary data sets and things like this, but the majority of it's public data. And we know that data is flawed. It only contains whatever we've put out there. And it's not representative of the full population, full messy human complexity. And that's a problem because now it's inferring for us and potentially in future making decisions on our behalf. And it can only do that as well as it can represent us. And then, so misuse, cyber attacks, and threats. So that AI can be used or can act in ways that cause real harm at scale, e.g. if it's in the hands of bad actors. So we already see, versions of this. I got a very convincing phishing email a few weeks ago, right? Or it could scale scams massively, basically turbocharging any of those existing. Those have been around for a long time, but now AI can exacerbate, lowers the barriers for people to carry out cyber attacks. That was kind of Anthropic's concern, one of them. And that, yeah, and then in the hands of bad actors, then it gets even broader, oppressive political regimes, or to scale the impacts of warfare, where you replace human decision making with a AI tool or weapon, making that decision instead. And then finally, content authenticity and trust, so that we're losing the ability to reliably tell what's real and what isn't. And this one is very evident. You just go on your social media platform of choice, you'll see a huge number of AI generated videos, voices, images, so deep fakes. And it's a real risk because that can be used for fraud, impersonation, even political manipulation. So it's really important that somehow we catch up with being able to tell what's true and what's not, because right now we're also in a moment where real content can be dismissed as fake, which is what's called the liar's dividend. So it's sort of like, are we going to start to doubt everything we see or hear, whether it's real or generated? So these are all of the concerns right now, and how they're being addressed. So for each one, I listed some of the kind of policy or institutional response, and then some examples of companies who are addressing these areas. So data security. I think GDPR has been around for a long time. AI Act in Europe, for example, and some enterprise level initiatives there. But actually, one of the biggest shifts we're seeing, which will be huge, actually. So if there's one thing you take away, honestly, from this webinar, I think it should be this. We are seeing a shift towards private AI deployment and on-premise AI deployment. What that means is that instead of sending your sensitive data out to these public models that currently everything's been built upon, companies first and now are bringing the models inside their own environments. So on premise, or having them in private cloud, or in their kind of a secure enclave that they can manage. And so that means that eventually there will be less and less dependence on those large language model players and the foundation shops. In fact, and this is sort of projecting far out, but there may come a point when we rarely need them entirely. That's just, don't take that as gospel. It's just my thought on it, but it really is a huge shift. And even like for us individually, we will have on-device models at some point in time, right? So your phone or your laptop. And there are smaller models becoming good enough for many tasks that, again, you don't need to have it all built on top of those LLMs. So it's a huge shift, and it's already starting to happen. And but in terms of the example companies here, many have heard of Protect AI. Hidden Layers, another that monitors models for suspicious behavior. So to see how the data is being used, to see what extrapolations are being made off of private data, for example, and things like this. On the model integrity, bias, and alignment front, mostly, so the UNESCO AI ethics recommendation, I think that was actually launched in 2021. So it's been around for a while, and it's like over 100 or 150 companies have now signed this. Same with the OECD AI principles. These are all about standards for evaluation and audit, and increasingly making it critical that models are explainable and accountable, so that they're even flagging their own bias or where they may be making inferences based on incomplete data sets, that is transparent not only to the developers, but to the user who's using it. And then red teaming, which is basically attacking your own model. So you test it for bias, for manipulation, and see how it performs. And it's actually, in red teaming, it's a good thing if you can break it. And so scale AI, again, very large one, more people have increasingly people have heard of, are focused on doing those evaluations and testing, yeah, where do things break? How reliable are they? Do they behave as we expect them to behave after being deployed? Misuse. So, yeah, in the US, CISA is pushing this secure by design approach, which is a good thing. It means safety cannot just be this afterthought. You can't just say, yeah, we're going to address that down the line or once something breaks. It has to be built in upfront. So it's becoming a really proactive consideration. ENISA in Europe is then they're doing create this threat mapping landscape. So to see how could AI systems be exploited across many areas, cyber, infrastructure, and so on, and creating that again proactively to be able to look for risk and mitigate. And then DEF CON was a red teaming example, but basically they opened up AI models to thousands of hackers and were like, have at them. And rewarded them actually if and when they could break them. And Gray Swan, I mean, out of the companies here, Gray Swan is a good example of similar things. So they simulate how bad actors might attack or misuse AI systems. So again, it's like a form of stress testing from this very kind of adversarial perspective before any of those vulnerabilities are actually live and out there in the world to be exploited. And then finally on content, so C2PA and CAI, these are all provenance initiatives. And provenance basically means like, can you prove where content comes from? And increasingly creating these almost digital nutrition labels for AI generated content to be able to look at, where was it created, when, by whom, and so on. And they're incentivizing this to be taken very seriously. Same with the increasing regulatory pressure on fakes. And I really see that an entire industry will arise now here around trust, around truth. It's kind of the rise of the truth economy because digital identity verification and validating identity is going to be absolutely enormous and critical. And there's interesting intersections also there with blockchain. But I one of my hypotheses when I talk about future of work is that trust and truth as an entire industry and as an economy in its own right will become a huge thing. And there are good, like TruePic over here on the example companies, they are working to actually prove authenticity at the point of capture. So you can verify that an image or a video is real rather than having to try to, at that point in time, rather than trying to detect the fake later on. And there's other ones like MediaWise and so on and so forth. So in any case, why does all of this matter for capital, for people on this call listening? Well, many reasons, but not least because a new market is forming. So AI risk is actually becoming an incredibly important investment space. Safety, security, assurance will be a multi-billion-dollar industry, if not honestly, trillion-dollar industry in its own right. And we're already seeing winners emerge. There are unicorns and near unicorns, but I didn't even talk about Goodfire or Protect AI, although maybe that one was on there. AI underwriting company, which we're going to get to. So we're seeing these breakout companies who are capturing this space and scaling incredibly quickly. And in many ways, it mirrors what happened with cybersecurity alongside the internet. So there is some precedent for it, but I'd say this is even larger. Risk is becoming measurable. So we're actually seeing the emergence of AI underwriting and insurance, which turns these risks we talked about into a priced asset. And that's where there's a company called AI Underwriting Company, which is, possibly a unicorn at this stage, if not very close to it. And they're basically measuring the risk, standardizing how they evaluate that, creating the framework and underwriting it. And that it creates demand then to further monitor this and evaluate it. And so again, reinforces the creation of this market. Regulation mandating spend. So all the policy initiatives we looked at on the last page means enterprises and any company building in this space has to demonstrate compliance. They can't just say, "Oh yeah, we intend on it. We'll get to it." It is a prerequisite for deployment, and so we will see, especially in enterprise, that AI risk, safety, security becomes budgeted, recurring annual spend for corporates, which is a good indicator. I mean, that's a strong signal. And well, to that point, right? Enterprises cannot deploy without risk management. I just made this point. So, and there's been some examples in the news, like the Bard and Watson stories, where we saw, and now enterprises are waking up to the fact that they will face real legal and financial and reputational risks if they don't consider this seriously. And so they are more tightly monitoring it and looking at this. And then finally, it goes back to, I mean, it goes back to the first point I made about Anthropic. The frontier labs are showing restraint, and that is a strong signal as well. So they are investing in safety. They're limiting deployment where it makes sense or where they have their own concerns. They're openly talking about risk, putting out press releases about it. And that's new. And it means that we were in this moment of kind of like accelerationism. And there's a little bit of a shift now away from that, which is also unsurprising given, as I mentioned, public sentiment is very mixed, but mostly leans negative right now, and a lot of concern, anxiety, et cetera. So the point is, this spend is becoming mandatory, and it's no longer optional, and therefore it will represent a core layer of the AI stack and a rapidly scaling investment category as we move forwards. So what should investors be asking given all of this? And I separated this into buckets because there's some core questions that if you're investing in AI or considering the space, you should always be asking. Now there's some risk and security specific ones that I would be asking. And then there's some broader questions around humanity and integrity. Why? Because all of this is pointing towards the fact that investing in this space it cannot any longer just be about the upside. There is now this inherent responsibility for downstream outcomes that's really coming to the forefront. And so we have to be conscious and intentional about how we approach this. So if you're an investor today, this is my suggestion. I would be asking, of course, on the core tech itself, I would be asking, is this solution doing something real? Or is it a wrapper on top of a model? Meaning, is it something that's just making use of one or a mix of LLMs to build something quick, but isn't actually defensible, and thus, so it's a wrapper solution that then makes it more risk of becoming obsolete if one of those foundation model players decides to launch a new version that can do that thing, right? Second, is this embedded in real workflows or easy to rip out? So is it actually embedded into where users are? Are they interfacing with it? Does it have stickiness from that perspective? Third, is the data defensible? And does it build a real moat over time? So yeah, defensibility is a huge thing to be looking at. Do these builders have access to proprietary data or ring-fenced pool of data or data sets that they uniquely can make use of? And does that strengthen and build over time to reinforce that moat? If not, again, at risk of someone else coming in and claiming that space. And then lastly, does this team truly understand the technology they're building on? And that actually is related to the risk point, because so many people have flooded into this space. But if you aren't savvy in the technology itself and you don't deeply understand it and the risk on all these levels, from enterprise to security to existential risks, then you are at risk yourself of exacerbating them, right? Or of building something unsafe, or of creating additional surfaces that risk can attach itself to. So it's actually really critical. Risk and security specifically, I would be asking things like, what happens if and when the system fails? What are the ramifications? How large are they? Could this be misused at scale by bad actors? So, and how would they get access? And is that being safeguarded against? Third, is this making systems safer or introducing new risks? And also ask founders these questions and ensure that they've thought through these, that they have good answers. And would a serious enterprise trust this in production, which is a good sign, especially if it is an enterprise AI solution. And then there's this other category, which is we're in a window where the trajectory we take with this technology is in many ways still up in the air. And so as capital allocators, we really have a strong role in shaping which way we go. And as a result, it's important to be asking these sorts of questions, starting with what sort of future does this contribute towards? Is it in service of a more flourishing human future? Or is it in service of giving people back agency or educating them or creating new pathways to financial inclusion or turbocharging our climate tech efforts or whatever it is? I mean, I'd ask this question to the founders. And if they can't, how is what you're building contribute towards a more flourishing human future? And see how they answer it and see if they've ever thought of it. Sometimes people haven't given them permission to think about it. So I'm not saying they're a bad person if they haven't, but this should be a prerequisite. Second, does it build trust or erode it? Pointing back to this moment of trust that we're in. Does it inform or influence? And I think this one's really important too. Like AI in many ways, in the hands of individuals and collectives who use it for these purposes, can be a great democratizer and a great equalizer because it puts the information of the world at people's fingertips and allows them now to do almost anything they want with it. I mean, the barrier's never been lower for someone with $0 in their bank account and a phone and access to the internet to launch a business or to sell a product or to reach the world in new ways. So it can inform and empower, or it can be used to move us further away from that and to further kind of impose influence or to shape in ways that are more harmful. So I think that's a good question to ask. Who wins here and who might be harmed? Critical. Also because that's a big topic at the moment. Who stands to gain from AI? And are the benefits unequally shared? This is a huge conversation. Then you get into discussion around universal basic income and all these sorts of things. But it's worth asking, who wins? Who is this in service of? And is there anyone who might be harmed inadvertently? And then finally, would I still stand by this decision in 10 years? And I think at least for many of our LPs and investors, of course, you're already thinking along those timeframes because vehicles can be 10 plus years in the space we're in. But I think it's a healthy sense check. And of course, also it's like, well, we can't fathom what we can't fathom. So 10 years time could be a vastly different world, but it's still worth putting the long-term hat on when it comes to these sort of decisions. And then I will just say, aside from asking these questions ourselves, our strategy is positioned for this sort of high risk, high uncertainty space. We have access to the frontier of the ecosystem and the VCs. We've actually started now partnering and investing in some funds who have an explicit AI safety and security thesis. And we have full stack exposure. So that has always included the safety and security layer, and even more so as it grows. And then our co-investments, where we do direct investments, it's kind of with value aligned companies selectively from what we see across this full perspective we have. And our firm is global. So we have strong US presence, strong UK, Europe presence, rest of world. So from a regulatory perspective, that's a benefit. Also, I think Europe has for a long time often led on safety, security, regulatory when it comes to tech. And largely because the regulatory environment's tends to be tighter there. So it's forced, right? And enterprises have to consider these things earlier. So we're watching that too, and more or less just staying disciplined through volatility and uncertainty. Yeah. This pretty much repeats what I said. It's diversified access globally by stage with a focus on the early stage and then across the AI stack, and some of our edge, which I mentioned. But I'll just finish on the bottom line for this webinar specifically, which is that AI certainly is scaling faster than controls can keep up right now. And we saw safety does tend to lag behind all innovation, but this is now a new, it's that times 10. And that gap that's being created creates both a systemic risk, but also an opportunity for the market to catch up, for all of us to catch up. And so safety and security are going to become absolute default layers of the AI stack going forward. Capital will flow to those systems, not just because it's growing, but because without them, AI is not usable. And even if it is usable, it won't be trusted for use. So this has to catch up now. In fact, it's probably going to be the hottest, fastest growing segment of the AI space in the next few years. And so for investors and capital allocators, we would say, think first like a human. We're all moving into this fifth era together, and we're all using these technologies and we're all influenced by them. So I'd think first with that lens, and then as an investor, be selective, be very conscientious, be asking those sort of questions that we listed. Back technical depth over narrative. Increasingly, this is becoming important. Just that they understand the risks associated and have a plan to address them. It doesn't mean the founder has to be the most highly technical person themselves. In fact, you see more and more humanists, ethicists, policymakers moving into this space. And they are wonderful people to build because they understand the need very deeply. So long as they're also finding ways to augment with the technical knowledge. And then finally, this is now becoming enabling infrastructure. So it's less sexy than the app layer still exploding on the top and all these cool new things we can do with this technology, but it is going to be critical. So to have a focus and an eye on this area, not just what tends to attract attention. Thank you. That's it for this webinar today. I'm going to stop recording, and if there's questions, I'll stay for Q&A.